Hello, my name is Maxine Moffett, and you are tuned in to Bridge Africa This Week, the program that connects you to Africa's top news stories, from politics to economics and sports to culture. Our top headline stories include: members of the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries failed to reach an agreement on an output cap needed to stabilize oil prices. 400 Ugandan cancer patients are expected in Kenya to receive treatment. Kenya's Rugby 7 will feature for the first time in this summer's Olympics in Rio. Thank you so much for tuning in to Bridge Africa This Week. After this break, we'll begin with the show. Members of the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries failed to reach an agreement on an output cap needed to stabilize oil prices. 4 African countries who are members of the organization were a part of the Doha meeting.
Sunday's talks in Doha's capital saw the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries trying to agree that average daily crude oil production in the coming months will not exceed levels recorded in January. But after 6 hours of negotiations, a deal wasn't reached. Oman's oil minister, Mohammed Al-Romhi, said one reason a deal could not be reached was due to the absence of Iran. Iran previously said it would not accept proposals to cap its production until it recovered a similar market share to that which it held before the sanctions were imposed. The run-up to the summit saw months of disagreements about the impact any freeze would have on individual OPEC member countries. Despite tanking prices and a glut in global supplies, OPEC member countries had previously increased production levels. As disagreement grew which strategy to take, the bloc is made up of 14 countries with 4 from Africa. These African oil producers include Algeria, Angola, Libya, and Nigeria.
A bridge described as Africa's longest has opened in Tanzania's main city, Dar es Salaam, to ease overcrowding on ferries. The 680-meter bridge links the city center with southern neighborhoods across the Indian Ocean. Tanzania's leader, John Magufuli, hailed it as liberation for residents in the city of more than 4 million inhabitants.
The Chinese firm which built the $140 million structure says it is East Africa's longest cable-stayed bridge. It is also the first toll road in Tanzania. The prices are yet to be set. Vehicles and motorcycles will have to pay. Pedestrians and bicycles will have free passage. Correspondents say until now, commuters' only option to cross over the creek to the Kigamboni suburbs was in badly maintained ferries, and they were often held up for hours because of breakdowns. Motorists also take their cars onto the ferries, and some fall into the sea when not properly loaded. The bridge links to an area earmarked in 2010 for an ambitious plan to build a satellite city known as the Kigamboni New City Development. The government also hopes that it will boost tourism, making it easier for people to go to beaches on the other side of the city. At a ceremony to open the bridge, Mr. Magufuli described the 7-lane cable-stayed bridge as the only one of its kind in Central and East Africa. He said it should be named Nyerere Bridge after Tanzania's first president, Julius Nyerere, saying the idea was first mooted by him. Mr. Nyerere led Tanzania, or what was known as Tanganyika, to independence from the UK in 1960.
Nearly 12,000 Mozambicans seeking asylum have crossed the border into Malawi since December. There was excitement as the first buses arrived to move them to their newly located Luwani camp.
The buses traveled 320 kilometers through the camp. Upon arrival, the UN Refugee Agency gave the refugees food and utensils and assigned each family to a plot. Tents were already set up there. Before its official closure in 2007, the Luwani camp hosted more than 300,000 Mozambican refugees who had fled civil war between 1977 and 1992. The people being relocated here are from Mazambezia province, one of 5 opposition strongholds where there has been sporadic fighting since the disputed 2014 elections. Increased tensions last year pushed thousands of civilians to flee. The reopening of Luwani camp has been controversial for some. The governor of one affected district in Mozambique told state radio there that in March there has been no conflict. He said people were fleeing drought and food shortages. The UN Refugee Agency said the relocation exercise continues all week. A UNHCR field officer told Voice of America that asylum seekers as well as host community would have access to health facilities and education.
Libya's unity government has warned that Islamic State militants will establish a stronghold in the town of Sirte on the Meridian coast in 2015 could take over 2/3 of the country. President Obama made the same remarks, adding that the Islamic State recruits are increasingly heading to Libya, following the setbacks the militant group had suffered in Iraq and Syria.
The new UN-backed government arrived in Libya's capital, Tripoli, earlier this month in the hope of restoring order in a country controlled by rival militias, governments, and parliaments. Last week, President Obama said the worst mistake of his presidency was his failure to plan for the aftermath of the ousting of Libyan leader Colonel Muammar Gaddafi in 2011. All these statements reflect the deep insecurity in the country. Islamic State has exploited the chaos to gain a foothold in the North African state. Last year, the group appealed to its sympathizers in Africa to go to Libya, which it sees as a gateway for attacks on Europe. Speaking after a meeting with security officials at CIA headquarters, President Obama said the number of Islamic State fighters was at its lowest in 2 years because of the offensive against it by a 66-member coalition. But a top U.S. commander for Africa, General David Rodriguez, suggested week that the number of Islamic State fighters in Libya probably doubled in the past 12 to 18 months to between 4,000 and 6,000. These figures reflect the increasing capacity of terrorists in Libya.
A series of apps which help teach Malawian school children math, English, and local language Chichewa has been introduced in 68 schools in the country.
The UK's Voluntary Service Overseas, VSO charity, has joined with the schools and the non-profit 1 billion organization to teach 4- and 5-year-olds. Education in Malawi schools is often basic. Classes of 80 or 90 pupils are normal, and teachers can struggle to monitor whether pupils are keeping up. The apps allow teachers to monitor every pupil's progress, thus allowing them to modify lessons and improve results.
A Kenyan hospital agreed to provide free cancer treatment to 400 patients from Uganda, as the country's only radiotherapy machine has broken down. The radiotherapy machine was donated in 1995.
The Aga Khan University Hospital said it would do all it could to help and encourage others to do the same. The breakdown of the machine in Uganda has left thousands at risk of missing potential life-saving treatment. Uganda's government has said it would cover the travel and other costs for the 400 patients going to Aga Khan University Hospital in Nairobi. The private non-profit hospital in the Kenyan capital has 2 radiotherapy units and 6 radiation oncologists. Radiotherapy treatment can be expensive, and most patients in Uganda are unable to afford to pay for the treatment. Details of how to transport the patients who are being worked out by the relevant authorities, the hospital statement added. The BBC says the Ugandan government has also agreed to pay for the 400 patients' accommodation and food, as well as for those of relatives or friends if an attendant is needed. The government says it has purchased a new radiotherapy machine and it should be up and running in 6 months once a special bunker has been built to house the radioactive equipment at Mulago Hospital in Kampala. Other treatments are still available in Uganda, but the Cancer Institute at Mologa Hospital says that 3/4 of the 44,000 new cancer patients in Uganda last year needed radiotherapy. The incidence of cancer is on the rise in Africa overall as life expectancy increases.
Up next on Bridge Africa this week, Ban Ki-moon encourages peace talks in South Sudan. UK Foreign Secretary Philip Hammond visited Libya in a show of support for the country's United Nations-backed National Unity Government. The new government arrived in Libya's capital, Tripoli, earlier this month with hope of restoring order to the country.
The UK Foreign Secretary met Prime Minister-designate Fayez Sarraj in Tripoli and pledged £10 million in funding for the new government. This comes amid speculation that British troops could be sent to train their Libyan counterparts. Libya has been beset by chaos since NATO-backed forces overthrew former ruler Colonel Muammar Gaddafi in October 2011. Mr. Hammond's visit comes days after a visit from the French and German foreign ministers, who also gave the new government of national accord their backing. The money pledged by the UK includes £1.5 million for tackling illegal migration, smuggling and organized crime, and £1.8 million to support counter-terrorism activities. The UK Foreign Office said Mr. Hammond also discussed the UK's plans for rebuilding the economy and restoring public services in Libya. It is the first visit of a UK Foreign Secretary to Libya since 2011. The British Embassy in Tripoli was evacuated in 2014.
U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry expressed solidarity with Egyptian President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi on issues of security and economic cooperation between the two countries. He was speaking in Cairo ahead of his visit to Saudi Arabia.
The American people are committed to the security and political and economic well-being of the Egyptian people, and we will work with you to absolutely secure the ambitious and important goals, the vision that you have laid out here today. There is absolutely no question that the emergence of a strong, prosperous, democratic Egypt is critical for the development of a strong and prosperous region. All of us have a stake in Egypt's success, and all of the Middle East needs to see that what Egyptians struggled to achieve in 2011 was the real birth of opportunity and not an illusion. We all know also that there are challenges, and yet every single one of us are here because through those challenges we see and understand the extraordinary potential.
Last month, comments by the United States Secretary of State on the human rights situation in Egypt sparked outrage in the country's new parliament. According to local media, several research organizations and human rights groups are under investigation. The United States has provided military and logistical supports to countries in the region to fight terrorists against the group Boko Haram. Our security consultant, Randy Joe Sah, has been following up on the story, and he now joins us. So what assessment would you give to the United States military support of Cameroon and neighboring countries' fight against Boko Haram?
I think this is an important visit, given the role of the United States in the fight against terrorism in Cameroon and the Central African sub-region. You know, the U.S. is involved. They have troops on the ground. They're helping us with technology, with tracking terrorists, both through intelligence and the use of drones. The U.S. is also involved in the training of Cameroonian soldiers as well as Chadian soldiers. And so the U.S. ambassador to the UN coming to Cameroon at this time is very relevant, because she has to see into what is actually happened practically. She has to assess the results of U.S. involvement so far and maybe a way forward, looking at the way forward. She was meeting with President Paul Biya, and they had 2 hours of discussions on these issues.
How successful have these U.S. military interventions been thus far?
Well, you know, Cameroonian forces were very involved in this war against terrorism for a long time. And people were wondering what the international community was doing, not coming to the aid of Cameroon. That eventually came, You know, we have about 300 U.S. troops on the ground here who are not involved in the day-to-day fighting, but they are carrying out surveillance training, and their involvement has, in these last months and this last year, helped to accelerate the fight against Boko Haram, because there's been more intelligence gathering, there's been more precision strikes on Boko Haram targets, thanks to the activities of the drone. Well, these are activities that are not very open, are not very clear, are not made public. If you see the progress the soldiers in the sub-region are making, you can't afford to exclude the U.S. support and the positive action it has brought.
And what contribution do you think the United Nations has made thus far in the fight against Boko Haram in Cameroon and around the sub-region?
The United Nations has been involved in a very critical way. You know, this war against terrorism is generating a lot of hardship on the populations of Nigeria, Cameroon, Chad, and Niger. And so the U.S. agencies have been involved here in taking care of refugees, setting up camps and sites for the refugees, and there are tens of thousands of them. They've been involved in providing food, shelter, water, health. And you could see Samantha meeting the refugees. Her body language was very important. It was very reassuring to the refugees with whom she had a one-on-one talk. And so we're looking forward to more involvement by the UN. You know, there's also been the support, may not have been physical, but there's UN support to the troops of this central region who are all involved in this critical fight.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Randy Joe Sah. The government of Ethiopia said the death toll from a raid carried out by attackers from South Sudan in western Ethiopia rose to 208 people. 108 children were kidnapped during the attack.
The attack occurred in the Horn of Africa's nation's Gambela region, which alongside the neighboring province hosts more than 284,000 South Sudanese refugees who fled the conflict in the country. Cross-border cattle raids have happened in the past in the same area, often involving Mole tribesmen from South Sudanese, Jonglei and Upper Nile regions, areas which are watched with weapons that share borders with Ethiopia. The attackers are not believed to have any links with South Sudanese government troops or rebel forces who fought for the government in Juba in a civil war that ended with a peace deal signed last year. South Sudanese officials were not immediately available for comment. Under pressure from neighboring states, the United States, the UN and other powers, South Sudan's feeding side signed an initial peace deal in August and agreed to share out ministerial positions in January.
The expected return of South Sudan's rebel leader, Riek Machar, to the capital of Juba has been delayed. He was expected on Monday to take up the post of first vice president in the new unity government, which is the key part of the deal aimed at ending more than 2 years of conflict within the country.
The telephone call came as rebel leader Riek Machar prepared to return to the capital, Juba, to be sworn in and set up the government with President Salva Kiir. The United Nations says Mr. Ban Ki-moon praised President Salva Kiir for his decision to welcome Machar to Juba and called on him to implement security arrangements outlined in the peace deal that President Salva Kiir and Machar signed last August. Mr. Ban Ki-moon welcomed Machar's decision to return to Juba and urged him to work with the president to prevent further violence. The rebel leader had been expected to arrive on Monday in Juba, but a spokesman for the rebel advance team said a lack of flight clearance will delay him until Tuesday. South Sudan erupted into civil war in December 2013, 6 months after President Salva Kiir fired Machar as vice president. 2.5 years of fighting has killed tens of thousands and displaced more than 2 million South Sudanese from their homes. Aid agencies warn the country is at the brink of a humanitarian catastrophe caused by poor harvest and food shortages since the start of the war.
And now we'll communicate more about the recent issues in South Sudan with our lead correspondent, Valerie Kilo in Salar. So Valerie, tell me why there's been a delay for the installation of Riek Machar into South Sudan as the vice president.
Well, as you said, there's been a delay because he was due to arrive at Juba on Monday. He didn't show up. He was equally expected to arrive Juba on Tuesday. He never showed up, and this has raised a number of accounts as to why he never arrived. One account gives logistical reasons, saying that Riek Machar wasn't given clearance from the Sudanese government authorities. It is alleged that there was a plane transporting weapons, including missiles, and also military personnel, or if you like, rebels of Riek Machar, to the capital, Juba, and that is not agreed, or it's not really supposed to be the case following the peace accord of 2013, which actually limited the number of troops expected to arrive Juba from the rebel camp. So that's one account. Another account talks about rain. So these are two accounts that are coming up, and it's difficult to exactly
So one account
say
is saying that there's rain, and another account is saying that Riek Machar was actually going to come into the capital of South Sudan with rebel supporters of his opposition party, correct?
Yes, you're right. So, which makes it very difficult for one to really get a clearer idea of why he isn't there. But these are the two accounts that actually surfaced in the past few days.
But one thing we know for sure is that there was a delay for his installation, in fact. So what do you think is the importance of the installation of Riek Machar as vice president in South Sudan? How important is this towards the peace process?
Well, Riek Machar has been a very key political actor in the politics of South Sudan. Before his sacking as a vice president, he actually was very crucial in the peace process. Remember, there are key political actors in the country, Vice President himself, Riek Machar, and the current president of the country. So this gives you a very clear idea because he actually holds a major tribe in the country, known as the Nuas tribe. And if you notice, you look back at the war that's been going on in the country, it's been along sectarian lines, which means that we had a group like the Nua group, you know, of Riek Machar, and then another group led by the president of South Sudan, Salva Kiir, making the conflict to be along sectarian lines. So the coming and the installation of President Riek Machar, the vice president, is very crucial because it does testify the fact that Riek Machar wants peace and that South Sudanese government and the international community can now back him in the peace process in the country.
It's really good that this peace process is taking hold and the installation has, in fact, happened at this point. But I would like to know more about what you think the impact has been on South Sudan since they've been going through this civil war and conflict for more than 2 years.
One of the major impacts has been on refugees. In fact, as we speak, about 2.3 million refugees, Sudanese, has been displaced internally and externally. Most of them have been displaced in neighboring countries like the Democratic Republic of Congo, in Ethiopia, and in Uganda. So even Sudan itself, the neighboring country that, you know, actually separated from South Sudan back in 2011. So the United Nations High Commission for Refugees is saying, look, the impact is really huge. We are having a lot of lack of food, lack of health care, and so it's time for the conflict to actually end such that such humanitarian crisis shouldn't surface again in the country.
Thank you so much, Valerie, for joining us today.
It's my pleasure.
African football clubs enter a new experimental phase this week, with matches in the Champions League and Confederation Cup being played in midweek for the first time.
The Confederation of African Football has accepted requests for a change from its long-standing tradition of playing on weekends. Matches in both the annual club competitions
will be played on Tuesday and Wednesday as the Champions League and Confederation Cup reach the third round second leg stage. CAF's Director of Communications, Junior Biam, said the decision was taken upon the request of some member associations who, because of the scheduling of the inter-clubs competition, were left with less dates to host matches in local competition. Hosting continental club competition games in midweek will bring Africa in line with the rest of football world. Asia, the CONCACAF region, Europe and South America all host their Champions League games in midweek, but Africa has long favored the weekend because of a lack of floodlight facilities and the complexities of travel on the continent. But infrastructure development over the last 2 decades means there are now hardly any countries without the ability to play night games.
Kenyans shocked Fiji by winning 30-7 in the final of the Singapore Rugby Sevens to claim their first World Series title.
It took Kenya 140 tournaments to break their deck, and they are only the second African nation after South Africa to win a World Series leg, Kenyan President Uhuru Kenyatta said on Twitter. Join me in congratulating the Kenya 7 rugby team on their remarkable win. Rugby Sevens will feature for the first time in this summer's Olympics in Rio. Kenya, who qualified for the Olympics in the men's and women's events, opened up a 20-0 halftime lead over the favorites with 2 of their 4 tries coming from Collins Injera. Fiji, coached by former England Sevens coach Ben Ryan, briefly rallied after the break, but Kenya held a firm and scored 2 further tries to seal a convincing win.
Champion, and it is Kenya!
Thank you so much for watching Bridge Africa this week. My name is Maxine Moffett, and you can be sure to check us out on Facebook and Twitter at Bridge Africa 24 and get daily updates about news stories happening throughout the continent on our website, bridgeafrica24.com. Peace and blessings.